Hello everyone, Mike here, and this time with another history book review, one that's been in the works for a while. I started this book a couple of months ago, but it's a long one and a dense one, so it took me some time to get through. And that book is Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, by Simon Sebag Montefiore. As a very quick intro for those who don't know any of the history involved, the Soviet Union, which was centered in modern-day Russia, formed in the early 1920s following the Bolshevik Revolution, which was led by Vladimir Lenin and toppled the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II. The radically communist Bolshevik Party eventually won the power struggle that ensued. What followed then were a series of internal party struggles between the top-ranking Bolshevik Party leaders who struggled among themselves to become the de facto leader of the Soviet Union and essentially just run the show for years to come. It's a fascinating, albeit sometimes horrifying story, and there are a lot of great videos explaining it on YouTube, including even some animated ones, that I'd recommend checking out if you're interested. And the man who ultimately won this struggle and with it ascended to power and practically Tsar-like status for the next 30 years was Joseph Stalin, who this book is about. Stalin thus became a major player in world history and arguably the most influential leader in shaping what the Soviet Union came to be. His early policies, such as the Soviet Union's initial 5-year plan of expansion, spared no expense, neither in money nor in human lives, in their ambitious goal to catapult the Soviet Union to a position of global leadership. But these plans were overly ambitious, and as you could probably guess, given that he rose to power in a bitter political struggle and retained it for 30 years, there followed an excessive but highly effective amount of political repression and retribution against his opponents, and even against people who weren't so clearly his opponents, which formed a period sometimes called the Great Terror by historians. This series of purges and show trials cemented Stalin's grip on the party over his rivals inside the Soviet Union, but eventually Stalin found himself facing increasing pressure from Hitler's army of Nazis on the Soviet Union's western borders. He attempted first to broker some compromises with Hitler before eventually being betrayed and joining World War II on the ultimately victorious side of the Allied forces, in a delicate alliance with President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States and Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom. Before the war was even over, this fragile balance was already showing cracks, though, as the two sides raced to take control of Europe and, importantly, Germany, and the Soviet Union's looming power descended over Eastern Europe and even over East Berlin like an iron curtain, while the US scrambled to build the first nuclear bomb and to demonstrate to Stalin that they were still playing for effective global dominance as well. In Stalin's final years, he presided over essentially the beginning of the Cold War, an arms race, and a period of elevated tension in which the US, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the world by extension stood at the brink of nuclear annihilation. But that's a story for another time. This book turned out to be not exactly what I was looking for in it, and that was partly my own fault because I didn't pay close enough attention to its description. I was interested in learning about the history of the Soviet Union in the Stalin era, that is roughly the mid-1920s to the mid-1950s, having last year completed the excellent audiobook A People's Tragedy by Orlando Figes, which covers most of the events preceding that era in the revolution itself. This book does not do that, nor does it try to, which was my own oversight. The book's subtitle, The Court of the Red Tsar, means to indicate that we're not going to be focusing on Soviet history on a large scale. We're going to be focusing on Stalin's family, friends, commanders, and other pawns in his game of political domination and Soviet expansion. We won't even learn all that much about the fuller significance of Stalin's decisions and interactions with these characters, because the book is more focused on how the way he interacts with others illuminates his personality and his way of thinking. If you read this book, you will come out with a better understanding of who Stalin was, his general personality, and how he related to those close to him. You will not have an exceptionally better understanding of how these people fit into the broader framework of history outside their relationships with Stalin, or of the historical situation as a whole, because that's not what this book, which admittedly is a biography, is really about. If this sounds interesting to you, you may enjoy this book. The book is decent, though far from perfect, at what it attempts to do, and for that I found it valuable even though I didn't love it. But for a more general audience with a general interest in history, it's not going to be the first one that I'd pick up. I'd rate it at a medium to high difficulty level. The language itself is not super complicated or academic. I mean, if you're listening to this review and understanding the language that I'm using right now, you're already set to understand the language of the book. But really understanding it on a deeper than surface level is going to be quite a challenge. Now, this book is quite significant as an academic work. The research and interviews conducted for this book are really impressive. Many feature interviews with surviving members of his family and or his court of confidants, some of whom he betrayed later in their careers as they became less useful to him. At its publication in 2003, the book received praise from most Western scholars studying Russian history, presumably partly because it introduces all this original research and it takes a perspective different from what's seen in other biographies of Stalin. I haven't read any of these biographies though, so I can't really vouch for that, but there are quite a few, and experts do pretty much concur on this point. Quite a few of the expert reviews I saw though, such as Michiko Kakutani's in the New York Times, have suggested that this work serves best as a follow-up supplement to something like The Great Terror by Robert Conquest, which will place the events and importantly the characters of this book within the relevant historical context, since this book doesn't. So if you go into this book with a very clear intention that this is what you're looking for, it will deliver that, although I'm going to rock the boat just a little bit and say that I don't think it even did that quite as well as you believe from reading these critical reviews. It wasn't quite as revelatory to me as some of them make it out to be. So we learn about Stalin's style in his political and personal interactions, and thus we do in some ways get to know his personality by the end of the book. But I think this widely touted idea that we're getting to know him as a person in a whole new light is for me less profound than it would be for those who currently view him as a sort of mythical, larger-than-life villain of history. He kind of comes across basically just how I might have expected, so I wasn't too surprised by anything here. Now, perhaps this is because I also haven't read the other biographies of him, and I just didn't know a whole lot about him. For example, thinking about my perception of Stalin in comparison with, say, Hitler, who, growing up in the United States, I've for a long time learned about as a villain of history and therefore is, for me, a larger-than-life figure. I would have certainly found it more jarring to see a portrait of Hitler's personal life, even though it's kind of obvious if you think about it that yes, even Hitler had a personal life and a personality outside of his public one. And maybe that is part of why a lot of historians who do know a lot about Stalin already and his role in history found this book especially valuable, particularly since some of this information was classified or just not known about until very recently. Thus, how this book influences your impression of the man Stalin is going to depend on what you know and believe about him going into it, which will be different for every one of us. Indeed, looking through reviews on Goodreads and beyond, I saw that different people have taken away from this book entirely different impressions about Stalin. Some say that this book is conclusive evidence that Stalin was a monster, a sentiment expressed by Roy Hattersley in his review for The Observer, while others say something quite different, that they generally think of Stalin as a monster, but that this book gives him a little bit of a touch of humanity. As for me, although this book purports to show a more intimate picture of Stalin the man, I never really found myself feeling anything quite approaching empathy, even a revolted sort of empathy. Of course, I realize that the author is in somewhat of a bind because he can't just offer unsubstantiated speculation, and I admire his adherence to actual historical details as opposed to just inventing lots of total conjectures. Unfortunately, this book is sometimes for me too heavy on the facts and not heavy enough on the analysis and synthesis, simply piling on more and more details outside of a coherent or compelling thesis. Some sections ended up being a long fact dump of verifiable but boring details, such as what the Stalins ate for breakfast while on vacation on some particular day of some particular year, in a way that unfortunately fails to really add any life to these characters. Similarly, we hear numerous accounts of the sexual and extramarital affairs of Stalin and all of his cronies. Even though this goes beyond the single-track political analysis that we might see in other biographies, it still didn't enrich my understanding or appreciation of any of the characters in the way it was presented. For me, one of the aspects that stood out the most and that had the most potential was the book's coverage of the wide cast of characters, or the so-called inner court that interact with Stalin, analogous to the people that would have been in the Tsar's inner court just 30 years earlier. Some readers have commented in their reviews that this is a weakness of the book, that it goes on for way too long about characters who aren't actually Stalin. I don't really agree with this because since most of what we know about Stalin is through the perspectives and records of others around him, I think to understand him, it's absolutely essential that we understand who these characters are and what role they played. However, my criticism, and probably part of the reason why some readers still didn't find the wide cast of characters very interesting, is that other than a name and a title, we don't really learn who most of these characters are on a level that I would have really appreciated. Yet they still take up a disproportionate amount of the book with mostly irrelevant details such as their youthful sexual exploits or their tastes in alcohol, things that in my opinion should only be used to add color once a more substantial character profile has been established. Yet here they take center stage and often a substitute for actual character development. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself though. Who are these characters anyway? There are hundreds of names mentioned in this book, which can be a handful. The book version, which I looked through afterwards, starts with a cast list of like 100 or so of the most important characters, but even this is still probably less than half of all those appearing in the book at some point. And it's still also hard to know which characters are going to be important when we first meet them. In many cases, they ended up sort of blurring together in my mind, not really even because I struggled so much with the Russian names, but also because their abbreviated bios and my lack of prior familiarity made it so that a lot of them just failed to stand out to me. Like, I remember that there was a guy named Orjonikidze, and one named Yezhov, and another one named Puskrobyshev. I remember their names, I just couldn't remember who they were. The result was that every so often I spent some effort on Wikipedia trying to figure out who these characters actually were and what their broader roles were within the framework of Soviet history, or even just what their appointed positions actually entailed, since sometimes a name like General Secretary isn't going to be that meaningful unless you have an understanding of the Soviet history and hierarchy. This probably sounds like I was putting in more effort than the average reader, but in my opinion, this really is the only way that you can read this book effectively. At least if you're like me and not already familiar with who all these people are and what else was going on in Russia at the time, you can't just read through it and say, that's that. You're going to have to do some pretty extensive cross-referencing and looking up of historical events, locations, and people. You see, this just isn't the sort of book that you can easily read at a high level, skimming off main ideas without thinking too hard or paying too close attention to who all the characters are and why they're important. I made the mistake of this at one point partway through the book, and I quickly became bored and lost any sense of the overall narrative, so I ended up having to go back and re-listen to that section again just to catch the stuff I missed. And unfortunately, despite its promise, this is just where the book fell short for me. Most of the characters were written simply as satellites in their relationship with Stalin. We hear an awful lot about all these characters repeatedly throughout the book, but they always seem to serve merely as people for Stalin to bounce ideas off, or to interact with, or as people to give us inside information about him, and how he affected the Soviet Union. They rarely, if ever, feel like true characters in their own rights, and this made it hard for me to feel that invested in even the more recurring ones like Beria or Molotov or even Stalin's daughter Svetlana, because for me there was always this clear boundary where this is not really their story. The overall organization of the book contributes somewhat to this problem. The book is told in pretty strict chronological order, and when a new character enters the fray, we might hear just a little bit of their backstory, but before too long we'll jump right back into the main narrative thread, as if Stalin's going to flip out if he leaves our attention for more than a few pages. Frustratingly, we might return to the same character many chapters later for another few pages, but in a way that tends to just continually distract us more than to tie up this character's story in our minds. Stalin's son Vasily is a prime example. We learn about him many times throughout the book without ever really meeting him on the level that I would have liked to. He's always remains a bit of a caricature, this spoiled and disappointing son who never lives up to Stalin's expectations, instead just getting himself into trouble, crash-landing airplanes on drunken joyrides. It's a surface-level characterization of Vasily that tells you what, where, and when he did it, but we don't have any idea what was actually going through the guy's head or what it must have been like to be just a regular dude whose inattentive father was the most revered and feared man in the entire nation. Similarly, Stalin's inner operatives and those actually executing the purges are occasionally portrayed sympathetically, but never to the point that you can really get an idea of what must have been going through their head as they carried out these gross injustices. So as written, these short interludes about other characters never really brought them to the level of true characters in my mind, never gained my interest or appreciation. Well, some of them did actually, but only from outside research, and not from their roles within the covers of this book. But a bit more on how this book is laid out might be useful if you're still not sure if it's for you. It basically covers everything that happened in Stalin's life starting somewhere in the 1920s to his death in 1953. The first half of his life is also documented in another book by the same author called Young Stalin. I haven't read it myself. This book, though, starts with some coverage of Stalin's life with his family and friends, much of it centering on this vacation home Zubalovo, where he spent time not only with his family, but with his political friends as well. And if the idea of Joseph Stalin having friends seems a little dubious to you, well, that's understandable, but also I'd argue part of the main value of this section and where it shines the most. I would say that the people who spent time with Stalin at his Zubalovo estate really were friends in some sense, involving camaraderie and shared experiences and some form of relaxation, but just not involving all the loyalty and sincerity that I hope to find in a friendship of my own. More on the level of casual drinking buddies than the kind of people who you'd make real sacrifices for. After all, some of the politician friends who spent time with Stalin at Zubalovo in the 20s, like the more conservative-leaning but still Bolshevik party member Nikolai Bukharin, who was shifting away from Stalin's ideology, would later lose his favor and be executed in one of the famous show trials. This early section of the book can feel a little bit scattered at times, including some portraits of characters who felt less relevant, not covered deeply enough to be important to the overall narrative, but some of the emerging players, like the future NKVD or secret police operative Beria, emerge in this part. This section also has the best coverage of Stalin's relationship with his wife and children, especially with his daughter Svetlana, who would later publicly reveal more of this experience after she sought political asylum in the US following her father's death. We then learn more about Stalin's early years in power and those leading up to the Great Terror, in which he purged his ranks of all political opponents, real or suspected. This was the part I found the most challenging to follow because there were a ton of new characters coming in and out. Still, we see the arbitrariness of whether someone would ultimately suffer Stalin's wrath or somehow finagle their way onto his good side despite his initial opposition. So this general sense of paranoia grew in Stalin's top ranks, and his cleverer officials tended more and more often just to kind of suck up to him, although we also learned that he didn't really like it when he knew people were sucking up to him, which was almost as annoying to him as when they actually expressed outright disagreement. So it was an intricate dance that these members of his inner court had to perform. But the difficult part of this section for me was that it ultimately ended up being a bunch of show trials and purges one by one, and since I don't know as much about the global and other political pressures Stalin was facing at the time, I failed to understand really how this list of name after name fit into the broader geopolitical and national political contexts. After this part, we make it into a section about Stalin's alliance with Hitler, Hitler's betrayal, and subsequently the Soviet Union's unexpected entry into World War II on the side of the Allied forces. I personally found this part easier to follow, but that might be because I know a little bit about the politics of World War II, including on the Russian front, and I'm familiar with the geography of the disputed regions. Readers not so familiar with the Russian front of World War II might struggle a bit in this section, but we'll probably still be able to follow it even without understanding the critical political significance of every single battle. Finally, we learn about the end-of-war struggle between the Soviet Union and the Western powers for influence in Europe, in which Stalin's so-called Iron Curtain descends over Eastern Europe, which Roosevelt's successor, President Harry Truman in the United States, grudgingly accepts, knowing that he'll soon have some nuclear bombs up his sleeve to keep Stalin from getting too aggressive with this whole communism thing. It looks for a moment like the aging Stalin is pretty satisfied with where he's arrived, after arguably getting pretty lucky to have made it through the whole World War II debacle and the surprise attack by Hitler. But he's far from complacent and remains more dangerous than ever, especially to those close to him. We see his right-hand men visibly jockeying to be his favorite and frequently denouncing each other to the boss, so that they can take over when he dies. Which he does die, but not before he attempts to assassinate the up-and-coming Yugoslav communist leader Tito, eggs on the communist leader Mao Zedong in the Korean War without himself committing any resources to North Korea's defense, and stirs up some anti-Jewish sentiments for reasons that will not be fully clear just from reading this book. This all happens pretty quickly though, and like in the rest of the book, the actual events of history occupy a backseat to the behind-the-scenes conversation between Stalin and his inner circle, and the intrigues of figuring out who will be his successor. While digesting this book, I enjoyed reading all sorts of reviews, some of which I'll link below, and although for some books reading the reviews can be kind of an afterthought, for this chunker of a book it was a critical part of my overall experience to see what key bits others pulled out. Based on the variety of takeaways I saw about the book and about Stalin himself, this book had different things to say for different people. I'm actually going to take that one step further though and say that this book lacks an overall thesis. The interpretation and broader meaning are largely left to us as readers, and Montefiore is almost too careful sometimes to avoid drawing conclusions or to step beyond what's written on the pages of history. But maybe this is a good thing for a history book. I don't know. What do you think? Leave me a comment if you read a lot of history books and have any opinion about this. So in spite of all the important flaws in this book that I've now discussed, I did take away some key points about Stalin's style and personality. Stalin had friends who hung out at his vacation homes with the family, but it was of course always political, and these friendships certainly could turn sour as many of them did. He was at least somewhat an intellectual and enjoyed reading a variety of influential writers, poets, and playwrights, even while being restrictive about what his citizens could access themselves. He was ruthless, but with touches of humanity, which, well, is not so surprising to me, as I mentioned, because Stalin for me has just never occupied that same larger-than-life place in my own mind as someone like Hitler, in spite of the war crimes that he's committed. He was ambitious, but patient too, sometimes having a certain modesty or humility, if you'd call it that, serving to slow down his rise in power, And I'm not clear to what extent this reflected an actual personality trait versus just being a more calculating ploy to seem like he wasn't really all that power hungry, even though some of his inner party members did seem to think he was. He acted with impunity, sometimes taking great offense to insult, other times laughing it off and genuinely dismissing it, or even defending the person's mistake. He was quick to exploit tragic circumstances to his advantage, like the death of his former political ally Kirov, which he used to eliminate all of his other political enemies and begin the Great Purge. He could be a charmer, especially when in the right mood and at the critical moment. For example, when Winston Churchill, or later Franklin Roosevelt, came to visit him and discuss the strategic terms of their country's involvement in World War II, Stalin presented himself in a way that, at least as told in this book, left them with glowing impressions of him. His overall political career was a product of some combination of genius strategy and dumb luck. He was a product of the Soviet system at the time, even if he did help create it. As Montefiore points out in the section of the book where Stalin is blindsided by Hitler's invasion, most political leaders could have never survived such a huge mistake and would have been replaced instantly. But Stalin reaped the benefits of the system he had helped create. There was no one else who had the power and bravado, or who had the guts for that matter, to step up and take his place. In summary, this is a challenging and long book covering how Stalin dealt with his ring of cronies in the second and more globally important half of his political career. I admire the historical work that was done to collect the material that went into this book and to integrate everything together. As just a casual historian myself, though, this book felt flat for me because it often piled details on top rather than synthesizing them in a way that increased my understanding of what was happening. Similarly, since this book focuses entirely on the man himself, it's harder to see how the themes and lessons of this book remain relevant today and inform modern geopolitics to the extent that we see in, say, Orlando Figes' A People's Tragedy. For example, one insightful question that many have asked is, did the Soviet Union turn out the way it did because Stalin was there to drive it in that direction, or was he simply the right person for what it was always going to be based on the political situation and the nature of the reforms that people were trying to achieve? But since these and other questions aren't discussed, I wouldn't recommend the book unless you know exactly what you're getting into and you're either a pretty serious Soviet history buff already, or you're excited to put in the extra research to become one as you're reading this book. Thanks a bunch for watching this deep dive history review. Let me know what you thought about the review and the book, and if you have any suggestions of other Russian history books I should check out, since I do plan on reading more, let me know that too. And until next time, happy reading.